This is Jaclyn Gustafson, and this is my presentation on the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act for Self-Directed Learning Opportunity Number 1. A Great Transition, America and the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act of 1862. The Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act of 1862 was established to provide for at least one college or school in every state where the leading object would be the teaching of topics related to agriculture and mechanic arts. You'll notice in this excerpt from the Act that a couple of significant things that we'll talk about later are included in here. First of all, this Act importantly distinguishes the type of education that the government would support via this act, and that would be very specifically focused on agriculture and the mechanic arts. It would be a shift to a more vocational type of education than the nation had known before. And in the last part of the act, the purpose of the act was to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions in life. So in this excerpt, we also see an emphasis on educating a different type of person who maybe had not been educated before, the industrial classes and those who were part of professions. As Lee noted, this time in America's history, and especially in American education, was a time of great transition. In this section, I've noted a few of those transitions as related to American higher education. First of all, there was a shift from parochial education to national. So more and more schools, more schools before had been established by small groups of people or maybe a certain denominational church in a very local area. And the nation became a little bit more concerned with education around this time. And evidence of this was the Morrill Land Grant Act itself, the fact that the nation became a little more concerned about a national type of education rather than a very locally based education. Secondly, the shift from classist education to democratic education. Previously, only an elite class of people had been able to go to college in the American colleges at the time. And the Land Grant Act marked kind of a shift to an awareness of democracies providing education for more people. So more people were to be educated in a democratic society than just one class. We also saw the shift from more sectarian or religious-based education to public forms of education. We also saw a shift in the curriculum. Vocational education would begin to be added to the curriculum, the classical curriculum that had been so established in American education previously. We also saw a change in where the money came from to provide for the more open and more education that reached more people. Instead of being more privately funded, we then started to see a little bit more national and federal support for education. So we saw several transitions, and what I'd like to examine in this presentation was how did such a great change come about? Specifically, I want to examine some of the factors in American education, in the national identity, in agriculture, and in politics that influenced the land grant colleges movement. First of all, I'd like to touch on education. So there was a lot of change going on in education at the time, and we already noted a change in curriculum, adding the vocational training to some of the classical curriculum, and this was starting to happen around the time of the Land Grant Colleges Act. Simon noted that the movement for a national system of vocational education emerged from an idealistic concern for the adaptation of existing educational resources to a changing society in a nation which generally believed that educational policy was a public concern. So vocational education would come about around this time when there was a lot of interest in national education. An idea from Puritanism also influenced the land-grant colleges movement. So Puritans had been involved in education in America for quite some time, and one of their tenets was that every child should be educated. Following along with that, however, if every child was to be educated, the community was going to need to support education for every child, especially for those children who couldn't afford it themselves. And the community who supported that education would then begin to expect that it would benefit from the education it provided to its children. So in these ideas that came from Puritanism from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, we already see two of the main ideas in the Morrill Land Grant colleges, that education should be for more people, but that also there's a leaning towards education that's useful. We also saw during this time some precedents for federal support of education. In 1785 and 1787, the government issued some land ordinances which set aside lands for education, and it provided somewhat of a precedence for the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act in that the federal government got involved in making land grants for a particular purpose, and that happened to be public education. So it did lead to a growing belief that education was to be a public concern. The changes in national identity at the time were also part of what opened America up to the idea of land grant colleges. First of all, you had ideas of federalism. These ideas were coming about because America was struggling with the difference between states and a national government. But throughout the 1800s and then throughout the Civil War, it became more of a federalist society where the nation would be able to make decisions for the nation as a whole and more centralized. And the thought process is that in a federal democracy, education is a federal concern, and that its support devolves in part upon the nation as a whole. So that right there, as Lee had noted, in a federalist nation, one that's going to act as one rather than as separate states, it would need to provide for the general welfare of the nation itself in education as well. And a democratic society, the democratic idea had been around for quite some time, but was beginning to be applied to education during this time. The land-grant college embodies a democratic ideal and belief in the wisdom of extending educational opportunity and of striving to place higher education within the reach of all who might profit from it. So that's a quote from Lee, and basically saying that in a democratic society, the education should be allowed and provided for all different kinds of people so they could strive to reach and profit from it. We see this very clearly in the Act itself. So this quote from the Act, the purpose of the Act was in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in the several pursuits and professions in life. So it's a very democratic idea that everyone is equal and everyone should have a chance. Which leads into the idea of the American dream. As Lee again noted, Horace Mann, even 30 years. While you might think that American farmers would stand to benefit the most from federal investment in agricultural research and education, they were quite skeptical of the idea of land-grant colleges or agricultural colleges. There was little farmer support of the land-grant idea, according to Rudolph. Farmers were used to learning their job on the job and growing up on the family farm. They weren't really interested in learning it at a college or a university. There was little value at the time of agricultural science, and they often met the idea of an agricultural college with amusement or laughter at the very idea of it. However, as Rudolph also noted, there were some agricultural societies within these agricultural locations out in the agricultural states that were interested in this idea of investing in agricultural science. They noticed that America was growing and changing, and that agriculture might need to grow and change with it. However, the farmers were going to hold out for results. And Rudolph also noted that they did end up coming around to the idea of the land grant colleges, but only several decades after the colleges had been established, when they could see results from the types of technology that were being developed at these colleges. Another interesting movement that was happening around the time of the Morrill Land Grant Colleges were some individual efforts to establish more vocational and agricultural education in America. Foremost among those who were doing this was Jonathan B. Turner. Turner was a classics and philosophy professor at Illinois College, and he has been called the true intellectual father of the land-grant university idea. Throughout his work, he made it his focus to provide education for the laboring classes in agriculture, commerce, and the arts. And he and other educators from other states began to turn their focus at this time to establishing colleges of agriculture. Quoting Francis Wayland, these colleges of agriculture would be designed to furnish the agriculturalist, the manufacturer, the mechanic, or the merchant with the education that will prepare him for the profession to which his life is to be devoted. So we had some educational reformers out there who were starting to talk about vocational education. And in the 1850s alone, we saw 3 agricultural colleges established, one in Michigan, one in Maryland, and one in Pennsylvania. While these individual efforts may not have directly led to the Morrill Land Grant legislation, if they're coupled with the land ordinances that we previously talked about, these colleges did provide evidence of the growing popularity of publicly supported vocational education. In the political realm, there were a lot of very interesting things happening. Around this time was the turmoil leading up to the Civil War. And Lee noted again, for 40 years leading up to the Civil War, the national debate had centered around this idea of the disposition of the national domain. So the questions were, who had the right to decide what to do with the abundant land in America? And following that, who had the right to decide what could and could not be done in that land? So politicians were debating the disposition of the national domain for quite some time prior to the Civil War. And these debates often split along South versus North lines. This national domain question was debated around issues such as slavery, the admissions of new territories as states, the Homestead Act, the Transcontinental Railroad, and our very own land-grant colleges. In politics, you also had some sectionalism between the Middle West, the East, the West, and the South, where these different groups of states were vying for their own needs. But while Morrill was submitting his act in Congress, there was a Southern secession. So those from the South who were opposing anything having to do with disposing of lands for a certain purpose, they actually seceded from the Union and were not involved in the political debates anymore. So their absence made the Congress a little more likely to accept an idea of a land grant. And secondly, President Lincoln came into office as well during the time that the Land Grant Act was being proposed. And he was much more in favor of a national government and much more in favor of a national government that would support education. So in the political realm, by the time the Land Grant Acts were proposed for the time it succeeded, the national political stage was quite a bit more better set for that act to actually pass. So in summary, so far, in education, we've seen a growing acknowledgement of the importance of utility in education and a growing comfort with, if not expectation of, public and even federal support of education. In agriculture, we still have skeptical farmers who aren't quite sure about this idea, but we do have some agricultural societies who might be in support of a land-grant college idea. In the national identity, we saw that federalism, democracy, and the American dream were very important, and all of these things kind of coalesced to the idea that providing for education for everyone became attractive to Americans. We have had some individual efforts to establish agricultural colleges, which also contributed to a growing popularity for vocational education. And in politics, the secession of the South made a national land grant a better possibility, and also the election of President Lincoln to the presidency made it more of a possibility that something like that could actually happen. So in general, the idea that the government bears a responsibility for the maintenance and promotion of education became more accepted during this time, and the Morrill Land Grant Act would definitely use this idea. Enter Justin Smith Morrill and his Land Grant Colleges Act. Morrill argued for the act on these several points. First of all, that European agriculture was technically advanced and they were poised to become even more advanced, and America needed to develop its agriculture to keep up. That currently American agriculture was stripping lands of their fertility, and if America was going to be a growing nation, new ways needed to be found to grow crops and feed people that weren't going to strip the lands of their fertility. And the idea of the government providing for the general welfare of the nation, both in food production and in education. There is a scientific need to develop agriculture from a scientific approach. That providing education for all classes was something that a democratic society should do. And that there was a precedence of government support for education. He would argue that it was not unconstitutional that the government support education, and that is something that his opponents would kind of oppose him on. This act would provide cheap and scientific education, would provide for the settlement of homesteads, would remove poverty, and enhance the beauty of the American landscape. In the political debate over the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act, the main argument centered around the right of Congress to dispose of lands in the states for a particular purpose. So it's this same question that had been asked for 40 years on the disposition of the national domain. The South argued that it was unconstitutional that Congress decide what any state should do with any land in its own territory. President Buchanan agreed that this would be unconstitutional to make a land grant for any particular type of educational purpose, and he also opposed it on several other points, that these new colleges would pose too much competition with current struggling institutions, that America could not afford this at this time, that there would be an increase in land speculation, that the act would be unenforceable in the states, and then lastly, that education was a state matter and not a federal one. As Simon noted, it was significant that the Congress didn't discuss in its debate the educational objectives of this act. So they didn't discuss whether it was worth putting their support behind agricultural or mechanic education. They mainly were debating over whether Congress had the right to do anything of this sort. Morrill proposed the act for the first time in 1857, and in 1858 it did pass both Congress and the Senate. However, it was vetoed by President Buchanan in 1858. He reintroduced it in 1861, and this was following the Southern secession, so things were looking quite a bit better for the bill. It was passed in July of 1862, and President Lincoln signed it into law. In conclusion, I hope that we've seen the various influences on the development of the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act in higher education, and that we've also been able to conclude some of the very significant impacts that the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act had on higher education in America. Three main points I wanted to bring out about the impact of the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act. First of all, the role of government in education was quite different before and after the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act. With the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act, we saw the largest support of higher education thus far in American history. And not only was this more support than the government had for higher education before, they also specified the type of education that they would be willing to support, and that specifically was agricultural or mechanic education. So the role of government in education definitely changed. We see the federal government continue to be involved in higher education. Today, many of our college students are in college because they are being supported by the federal government through financial aid to be there. We also see that our faculty are working on research that is funded by some federal agencies. So the government is still definitely playing a role in higher education today, and that did start with the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act on a large scale. Secondly, one of the major impacts of the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act was the addition of vocational education to the American college experience. So prior to the Land Grant Colleges Act, we had very little vocational education. And we definitely see this kind of idea continuing throughout American education even until today, where we are preparing students for jobs and not just cultivating their mind, although we still do both in education, and that the classical ideas of classical education have continued. We do have a much greater emphasis on vocational education than we had before the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act. And third, the Morrill Land Grant Colleges definitely brought education to more classes of people, to many more people than had access to it before. So it was really one of the first ways that, one of the first things that opened the door to mass education in colleges and universities. Today we see much more universal education, so starting with the Morrill Land Grant Colleges, we've grown to not just have mass education, but universal education. But the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act started that idea of educating more of the populace and providing higher education to more people. So I hope that we've seen the impact of the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act and some of the things that led up to it, some of the ideas in American higher education that came into play in the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act. Doubtlessly, there are many, many more ways that the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act has impacted higher education in America. And as we noted, American education today would be something vastly different had there been no Morrill Act and no land grant college movement. So definitely an important time in American higher education history. Thank you for joining me for my presentation today.